The spotlight was on Elon Musk as he stood at the podium, his fingers lightly brushing the surface of his notes, his mind sharp and focused. It was a moment he had worked toward for years. The crowd in the vast auditorium was alive with anticipation, hanging on every word he would say. This wasn't just another press conference or business announcement, it was the culmination of decades of vision, risk, and ambition. His latest venture, a revolutionary step towards sustainable energy, was about to be unveiled, and the world would be watching. Elon had prepared for this moment meticulously. His team had worked tirelessly to ensure everything would go off without a hitch. The timing of the launch was crucial, and the eyes of the tech world, not to mention investors and media outlets, were fixed on him. He felt the weight of the moment, but it was a weight he had come to understand well. His ability to block out distractions had become one of his defining traits. Whether navigating the complexities of SpaceX or Tesla, Elon was no stranger to pressure. As he began to speak, his voice steady and commanding, he could feel the energy in the room. The familiar hum of excitement filled the air, and Elon knew this was the moment that could change everything. The crowd's energy was almost palpable. There was a quiet intensity, the kind that only accompanied groundbreaking announcements. He was in his element, moving through his slides with practiced ease, explaining the intricate details of the new technology, how it would revolutionize the world's approach to clean energy. The audience was with him, their eyes locked on him, nodding in approval at every well-timed pause and insightful remark. Then, as he moved to the next part of his speech, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight movement in the corner of his eye, a flicker of something out of place. Elon didn't allow himself to break his rhythm, continuing to speak about the importance of innovation, but that flicker grew more distinct. He couldn't quite place it. Something was pulling his attention away from the crowd, drawing his eyes to the audience in the far-right section of the room. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the figures in the front rows who were nodding and scribbling notes, the faces that had come to expect his brilliance. But there was a face in the crowd that he couldn't shake, a face that seemed to pierce through the rest of the sea of onlookers. A woman, sitting several rows back, with an expression that stopped him in his tracks. It was like seeing a ghost from his past, someone he hadn't expected to see again. Her gaze was fixed on him, full of pride and an underlying sadness that he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just an ordinary face in the crowd. This woman, with her warm, knowing eyes, carried a history with him that stretched back to a time when the world was a much simpler place. For a split second, Elon's words faltered. His mind raced as he tried to reconcile the moment. Could it really be her? Could it truly be Emma, his middle school teacher, the one person who had believed in him when no one else did? The one who had seen potential in him long before his own self-confidence had caught up with the dreamers and doubters around him? He hadn't thought about her in years, but there she was, sitting quietly in the audience, her presence as undeniable as the weight of the memories flooding his mind. His heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, everything else, the presentation, the crowd, the new technology, the world, faded into the background. Elon didn't need to look at his notes anymore. The woman in the crowd had interrupted his carefully rehearsed thoughts, sending them careening down an unexpected path. He had been so certain of his focus, of the narrative he was telling. But now, in the midst of the most important speech of his career, his mind was racing back to a time long ago. His hands tightened around the microphone, and the sound of his own voice seemed distant. His body carried on with the speech, but his thoughts were far from the cutting-edge technology he was unveiling. He couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of recognition, the pull of her gaze that seemed to echo the feeling of encouragement, of hope, that Emma had instilled in him all those years ago. He quickly glanced back to the crowd, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. Emma was still there, watching him, her eyes locked onto his. And in that moment it was as if the years had disappeared, and he was no longer the CEO of two global companies. He was a young boy again, unsure of himself, walking into a classroom where a teacher had changed the trajectory of his life with a simple belief in his abilities. He had prepared for every possible distraction: press interviews, tough questions, unforeseen challenges, but this was something he wasn't ready for. Emma's presence was a reminder of a different time, a time when the world was not yet aware of the genius they were about to witness, when only a few believed in him. And now, years later, standing on the cusp of his greatest triumph, her face in the crowd made everything feel personal again. Elon's focus was unshakable, as he paced along the sideline, watching his team prepare for the final minutes of the game. The stakes were high, the energy in the stadium electric. The crowd roared with each passing second, their cheers fueling the intensity of the game. The roar of fans, the buzz of commentators, the blinding lights, nothing ever rattled him. He had always been able to tune out distractions, whether it was an impending deadline or the noise of the world clamoring around him. But tonight, something unusual happened. It was one of those crucial moments when the game could go either way, the tension palpable. Elon was fully engaged, his mind locked on every movement, his eyes following the ball, his team, the strategies unfolding before him. But then, as the ball flew into the air, there was a flicker in his peripheral vision. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the usual distractions that came with the bright lights of a packed stadium. However, it wasn't the usual hum of excitement or the flashes of cameras that caught his attention, it was something else. His gaze shifted toward the stands, and for a fleeting moment, his concentration wavered. There, sitting among the crowd, he spotted a woman. She wasn't standing, cheering, or waving like the other fans. No, she was sitting quietly, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that seemed to pull him in. Her face, though aged by time, was unmistakable. It was a face he hadn't seen in years, a face tied to a chapter of his life he had long ago buried under the layers of success, ambition, and the relentless march toward innovation. It was Mrs. Olivia Grant, his high school art teacher, the one person who had believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. The recognition hit him like a wave. Mrs. Grant had been more than just a teacher to him. She had been his guide, his mentor, the one who had seen something in him before anyone else had. Elon remembered those days vividly, his adolescent years filled with self-doubt, the feeling that he didn't quite fit in. He had always been a dreamer, a thinker, but back then, he wasn't yet the force that everyone would later come to know. He had been awkward, introverted, and unsure of his place in the world. But Mrs. Grant, with her gentle smile and unwavering encouragement, had seen potential in him that no one else had. She had believed in his ideas when they seemed too outlandish, nurtured his creativity when others doubted it, and always reminded him that the world needed the kind of innovative thinking he possessed. Elon had moved on from those days, as life had taken him down a path of technology and space exploration. But seeing her again, sitting there in the crowd, brought back a flood of memories. It was as if time had reversed itself. He could still remember the hours they had spent together after class, discussing everything from the future of technology to the nature of the universe. She had always encouraged him to think bigger, to not be afraid of his ideas, even when they seemed impossible. She had told him that true innovation came not from playing it safe, but from taking risks, from embracing the unknown. For a moment, everything around him seemed to blur. The noise of the crowd, the rapid movements of the game, the flashing lights, they all faded into the background. It was just him and Mrs. Grant, back in that classroom, with her warm and encouraging voice reminding him of his worth. It was hard to shake the feeling that her presence here was more than a coincidence. Why had she come to this game, to this moment? What had brought her to this point in time, so far from the small, quiet classroom where their story had begun? Elon's heart raced, a mix of gratitude, nostalgia, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility washing over him. He had never fully thanked her for everything she had done for him. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to reach out over the years, life had just moved too quickly, and there were always more pressing matters to attend to. Yet, in this fleeting moment, he realized just how much she had shaped him into the person he had become. But now wasn't the time to dwell on the past. He had a game to focus on, a team to lead, and a responsibility to them and the millions watching. His mind snapped back to the present as the ball hit the court once more. Yet, even as his focus returned, the lingering presence of Mrs. Grant stayed with him. She was still watching him, her eyes filled with pride and something else, a quiet longing, perhaps for the boy she had mentored all those years ago. And for the first time in a long while, Elon felt the pull of the past, a reminder that his journey hadn't been solely his own. It had been shaped by the people who had believed in him, who had seen something in him before the world had. As the game continued, Elon's thoughts remained divided. On the court, he was laser-focused, guiding his team through the final minutes. Off the court, however, his heart was somewhere else, with a teacher who had changed the course of his life. The game was in its final stretch, the air thick with anticipation as Elon paced along the sideline, his eyes never straying from the action on the court. The players were locked in a fierce battle, every pass, every shot, every play filled with purpose and desperation. But as much as he tried to stay focused, something, or rather, someone kept pulling his attention away from the game. He could feel his thoughts tug toward the stands, toward the woman he had spotted earlier, the one whose face had stopped him in his tracks, Mrs. Olivia Grant. It didn't make sense. Why was she here? What was she doing in the middle of a sold-out stadium, surrounded by people who had no idea who she was or the part she had played in his life? She was never one for the limelight, never one to seek attention. She had always been a quiet force, a person whose impact was felt more through her actions than her words. So why now, after all these years, had she decided to come to this game? It was the kind of thing that gnawed at him, the mystery of it, as the clock continued to tick down. Elon's gaze flickered toward her once more. But this time something shifted. She wasn't just sitting there watching him. She was looking at him, and in her eyes there was a depth of emotion that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just pride, though that was certainly there, but something else. A quiet recognition, a sense of knowing, of understanding that transcended the years. The sudden realization hit him: the woman in the stands wasn't just a teacher from his past, she was a mirror, reflecting the journey he had taken to get here, to this moment. He could see it now. She wasn't just there to watch him play. She was there to see the culmination of all the dreams they had talked about, the ones that had seemed so impossible all those years ago. And in that moment he understood something else she had always known. She had always known he could do it. Elon's heart began to race. The game, the cheering crowd, the buzz of excitement, none of it mattered anymore. The distraction was no longer just a fleeting thought. It was an undeniable force that pulled him in. Every part of his being wanted to go to her, to walk across the court and ask her why she was here, to reconnect, to finally acknowledge the role she had played in his life. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He glanced at his team, his mind trying to snap back to the present. But the connection with Mrs. Grant was too strong. It was as though time had bent itself around her presence, bringing their past and present together in a way that felt almost cosmic. How had she known? How had she known to come here, of all places? The game, the stakes, the championship, it all felt irrelevant now. What mattered, what truly mattered, was the woman who had shaped his future, who had believed in him when he couldn't even believe in himself. He couldn't keep avoiding it. The connection between them was undeniable, and it was pulling him in a direction he wasn't prepared for. The final buzzer was fast approaching, but Elon's thoughts were a million miles away. He could hear his name being shouted, the crowd's energy reaching a fever pitch, but everything seemed to blur into the background. All he could see was Mrs. Grant, sitting there in the stands, her presence as clear and certain as the court beneath his feet. The moment felt surreal, as though he were living in a dream. The game was no longer the thing that mattered most. The real game was the one they had played years ago, back in that quiet classroom where she had taught him more than just art. She had taught him to dream. She had taught him that the impossible could be possible, that his ideas had value, that the world wasn't always going to believe in him, but that didn't mean he should stop believing in himself. As the final buzzer sounded, signaling the end of the game, the crowd erupted into cheers, but Elon didn't move. His eyes were still fixed on Mrs. Grant. For a moment it was as though the world had stopped, the energy of the arena fading into silence. Everything in him screamed to go to her, to close the distance that had grown between them over the years. But before he could make a move, he felt something shift within him. A quiet certainty settled in his chest. It was time. Without thinking twice, Elon stepped off the sideline, his feet carrying him toward the stands. His teammates were caught up in the post-game celebrations, unaware of what was unfolding. But Elon was no longer concerned with the game. This moment, this unexpected connection, had become the most important thing. He moved quickly through the crowded arena, ignoring the curious glances of the staff and security guards who watched him pass. He reached the section where Mrs. Grant was sitting, her figure still glowing faintly under the arena lights. She hadn't noticed him approach, lost in her own thoughts. But as he neared, she finally turned, and their eyes met. The look on her face was enough to stop him in his tracks. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and joy, as though she had never imagined this moment would come. Elon stood there for a moment, the noise of the arena around him a distant hum. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. "Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thanked you properly." But you were right. You were right about everything." She reached out, her hands trembling, and grasped his. The connection between them was palpable, as if they were two pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. In that moment, Elon realized that some distractions weren't distractions at all. Some were the very things that reminded us of who we were, who helped us become who we are, and the paths we've traveled to get there. And sometimes, those connections were worth far more than any game. The final whistle blew, and the crowd erupted into a sea of excitement and cheers. The game was over, the victory was secured, but for Elon Musk, something far more important had just begun. As the sounds of celebration echoed in the arena, his focus wasn't on the flashing lights, the high fives, or the media awaiting him for post-game interviews. His thoughts were already elsewhere, pulled toward a place far more meaningful. He couldn't shake the image of her face, the woman who had suddenly appeared in the stands, the woman from his past. For years, he had buried the memory of her deep within, tucked away behind the whirlwind of business deals, rocket launches, and groundbreaking innovations. But in that moment, when his eyes met hers in the crowd, everything came rushing back: the laughter, the guidance, the difficult conversations that had shaped him into the person he had become. She was Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, his high school teacher. Elon hadn't seen her in over 2 decades, not since he had left the quiet, small town where his high school was located. Back then, he was a socially awkward teenager, more interested in coding and playing video games than fitting in. Eleanor had been one of the few who saw beyond his eccentricities. She had always believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. She was the one who encouraged him to dream bigger, to think beyond the limitations of his world, to pursue ideas that others dismissed as impossible. As he walked toward the locker room, a million thoughts ran through his mind. Why was she here? How had she even known to come to this game? And why now, after so many years? The questions were relentless, but before he could even process them fully, he found himself turning toward the exit, heading in the direction of the stands. He had to speak with her. He had to find out what had brought her back into his life. Elon pushed through the crowded hallways, the noise of the arena still buzzing in his ears. His footsteps quickened, and his heart raced, not from the adrenaline of the game, but from the anticipation of the encounter. When he reached the section where he had seen her earlier, his eyes scanned the seats. She was still there, sitting quietly in the midst of the chaos, her expression calm, but tinged with something else. He couldn't quite place it. Was it nostalgia? Or was it a sadness that only years of separation could bring? As he approached, Mrs. Thornton turned toward him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The years melted away, leaving only the connection they had shared back then. She smiled, but it wasn't a wide, joyful smile. It was small, reserved, as if she hadn't expected him to recognize her, or perhaps she wasn't sure how he would react. Elon, her voice was soft, yet carried a warmth that filled the space between them. "Is that really you?" For a moment he couldn't speak. He simply nodded, trying to keep the flood of emotions at bay. "I never thought I'd see you here, Mrs. Thornton. I thought I'd lost track of everyone from back then." She smiled again, this time with more emotion. "I'm not surprised you've come so far. You always had that spark, even when you didn't realize it yourself." Elon swallowed hard. He hadn't realized until now just how much her words had stayed with him over the years. She was right, of course. Back in high school, he had been so lost in his own world that he didn't fully appreciate what she had done for him. But now, standing in front of her, the gratitude hit him like a wave. Elon began, his voice cracking slightly. "I owe so much to you, Mrs. Thornton. You were the one who told me to think bigger. You were the one who helped me see that failure isn't the end, that it's just a part of the process. If it weren't for you, I'm not sure I'd be here today." She shook her head gently. "You did all the work, Elon. I just gave you a nudge in the right direction. It was always inside you. I'm just glad I could help you see that." There was a brief silence between them, and for a moment Elon forgot about the noise of the arena, the post-game celebration, the looming press conference. All that mattered was this connection, this moment of recognition between teacher and student. "I didn't expect this," she continued, her voice growing a little quieter. "To see you, I mean, after all these years. But I'm glad I did. I followed your career, watched you change the world with your ideas. And I'm proud, Elon, more proud than I ever thought I'd be." He felt a lump form in his throat. How could she still be so selfless, so gracious after all these years? How could she have watched him rise to the heights he had reached and not once demanded anything in return? "I'm glad you came tonight," he said, his voice steady now. "It means the world to me to see you again, to finally be able to thank you properly." Her eyes shimmered with something that looked like tears, but she wiped them away quickly, not wanting to appear vulnerable. "I didn't come here for thanks, Elon. I came here because I wanted to see you, see who you've become, and to remind you that no matter how far you go, you're never alone in this journey. There's always someone who believes in you." Elon's chest tightened. Those words, so simple yet so profound, reminded him of everything he had worked so hard to forget, everything he had buried beneath his success, his drive, his ambition. She had always been there for him, even from a distance, always believing in him when no one else did. He stepped closer, extending his hand to her. "I need you to know something. Everything I've done, everything I've built, it's because of you, Mrs. Thornton. I haven't forgotten the lessons you taught me. I'm not sure I could have succeeded without them." Her smile grew wider, and this time it reached her eyes. "Elon, I always knew you had it in you. But you've done it. You've proven that the impossible isn't impossible at all. And that's something you should always carry with you." In that moment, standing together amidst the crowd, Elon realized that some connections never fade. They stay with you, even through the passage of time, and when the right moment comes, they bring you back to where it all began. It wasn't just about the game anymore. It was about the journey, the lessons, and the people who helped shape it. And as he looked at Mrs. Thornton, Elon knew that she would always be a part of his story, one that had started long before rockets and electric cars, long before fame or fortune. It had started with a simple belief in him. And that belief had carried him further than he could have ever imagined. As Elon Musk stood there, face to face with Eleanor Thornton, the overwhelming emotions that had been building up inside him since the moment he recognized her began to surface. They stood in the midst of the post-game frenzy, the noise of the crowd still reverberating through the arena, but for him, it was as if everything had faded into the background. The flashing cameras, the excited voices, even the cheers of his team, all of it seemed distant. What mattered now was this rare and unexpected moment. Elon's mind raced back to his teenage years, the years before rockets and electric cars, before he'd become a household name. Back then, he had been a shy, awkward kid, more comfortable with books and gadgets than with people. He had been intelligent, yes, but emotionally distant, struggling with a sense of isolation that he had never quite shaken. Eleanor Thornton had seen through all of that, had seen beyond the awkwardness to the potential, the fire within him that he couldn't even see for himself. It wasn't just the encouragement she had given him that had shaped his path, it was the way she had made him feel seen, understood, and capable when no one else did. As he stood before her, surrounded by memories of a time he had long since buried, he realized that he had never truly thanked her. He had never fully acknowledged just how much her belief in him had meant. It wasn't just her encouragement that had kept him going, it was her quiet strength, the way she had stepped into his life at a time when he felt like no one understood him. "I didn't expect this," he said softly, his voice betraying the emotions that were rising within him. "I didn't expect to see you again, not like this." Eleanor smiled gently, but there was a sadness behind her eyes, something that Elon couldn't quite place. "I never thought I'd see you like this, either," she replied. The Elon Musk I knew back then was a different person, a young boy with big ideas but little belief in himself. It's amazing to see you now, to see all that you've become." Elon nodded, struggling to find the words that could express the depth of his gratitude. "You were there for me when I was lost. You told me I could do anything, that my ideas were worth something. You told me to dream bigger when no one else did. You made me believe that failure wasn't the end, that it was just a part of the journey." Eleanor's gaze softened. "I always knew you had it in you, Elon, but you were the one who had to make it happen. I just pointed you in the right direction." Elon swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. He had done it, yes, but he had done it because of her. He had reached the heights he had because someone believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. It wasn't just about the innovations or the successes, it was about the journey, the people who had helped shape him along the way. "There's something else I need to tell you," Elon continued, his voice growing heavier. "I owe so much to you, Eleanor. I've never truly said it, but I do. I owe you everything. Without you, I don't know if I would have made it this far." Eleanor looked taken aback, her eyes widening in surprise. You don't owe me anything, Elon. I just did what I thought was right. I saw your potential, and I encouraged you to go after it. That's all. You're the one who made it happen. No, Elon replied, shaking his head. It's not just that. It's the way you cared for me. The way you believed in me when no one else did. I never had anyone like you in my life. You were the one who helped me keep going when I felt like giving up. You helped me find the strength to keep moving forward. A single tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, as if trying to maintain some semblance of composure. I never expected you to remember all of that, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I never expected that what I said back then would have made such an impact on you. Elon was silent for a moment, his chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He had moved on with his life, focused on the future, on the next big thing, but he had never stopped to truly reflect on the people who had shaped him along the way. And now, standing in front of the woman who had played such a pivotal role in his early life, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. I think I've spent so much time trying to prove myself to the world, Elon admitted, his voice raw, that I forgot to acknowledge the people who helped me get here. And you were the first one, Eleanor. You were the one who gave me the courage to dream bigger. You were the one who made me believe in myself. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm but gentle. Elon, you didn't need my belief. You always had it in you. You just needed someone to remind you of that. And now look at what you've accomplished. You've changed the world. Elon felt a lump in his throat as he looked at her, seeing her not just as the teacher from his past, but as someone who had truly shaped the trajectory of his life. She had given him the courage to go after the impossible, to push boundaries, and to never stop believing in himself. I've been so focused on the future, he said, his voice faltering, that I forgot to stop and appreciate the people who helped me get here. But you were always there, even when I didn't realize it. The weight of those words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. The bond they shared, built on years of guidance, encouragement, and unwavering belief, was stronger than anything they could have said. And in that quiet, emotional moment, Elon Musk realized that sometimes the most profound moments in life weren't the ones that made headlines or changed the world. They were the ones that connected you to the people who had always been there for you, long before the success and the fame. The realization hit Elon like a tidal wave. Standing there with Eleanor Thornton, the woman who had been a guiding force in his youth, he understood that his life, his success, was not just a product of his hard work, but also of the people who believed in him when he could not believe in himself. As he listened to her speak, something within him shifted. The weight of gratitude he had carried for so long was suddenly too much to bear in silence. He had to act. Elon had built empires, launched rockets, and revolutionized industries, but in this moment he was confronted with something far more personal, a deep, unspoken debt that he needed to repay. The thought of Eleanor's quiet sacrifices, her unwavering support during his formative years, sparked something in him. It wasn't enough just to tell her how much he appreciated her. He needed to show her. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Eleanor had always put others first. Her life had been dedicated to the success of her students, to giving young people the opportunities they didn't even know they needed. And now, as she faced a difficult battle of her own, it was time for Elon to give back. This wasn't just a moment of recognition, it was a turning point, a chance to change the course of her life in the same way she had changed his. The very next day, Elon set his plan into motion. He didn't want any attention or fanfare. This was personal, and he didn't need a crowd to make it real. He reached out to his team of advisors, medical professionals, and friends, and began quietly orchestrating a life-changing gesture. First, he made calls to some of the best medical specialists in the country, those who could provide Eleanor with the cutting-edge care she needed. He wasn't going to let her fight this battle alone, not after everything she had done for him. Then, Elon reached out to a group of philanthropists and influential figures in his network, making sure that Eleanor's medical expenses, which were quickly mounting, would be taken care of. But he wasn't stopping there. Elon knew that this wasn't just about helping her recover physically, it was about honoring her legacy, ensuring that the work she had done for so many years continued long after she had gone. He arranged for a substantial donation to be made to the community center where she had worked tirelessly to mentor young people, a place that had shaped the lives of countless children, including his own. As he made these arrangements, Elon couldn't help but feel a surge of responsibility. It was one thing to be able to change the world with technology, to push the boundaries of space exploration. But this was different. This was about making a tangible difference in the life of someone who had given him so much. He wasn't just investing in Eleanor's well-being, he was investing in her legacy. Elon wanted to make sure that Eleanor felt seen, truly seen, not just as a teacher from his past, but as the incredible woman she was. He arranged for a private ceremony at the Warriors' next home game, a game where she would be honored in front of the crowd. It wouldn't be just a simple thank you, this would be a celebration of her entire life's work, a tribute to the countless lives she had impacted through her dedication and selflessness. He wanted her to know that her influence had reached further than she could have ever imagined. When the day finally arrived, Eleanor had no idea what was in store. Elon had invited her to the game under the pretense of just catching up, but what she didn't know was that the evening would be filled with more than just nostalgia, it would be a life-changing experience. As the game progressed, Elon kept a close eye on Eleanor, watching her every reaction. The moment she was called down to the court was surreal. The crowd roared in applause, but Elon's focus was on Eleanor's face, which was filled with surprise and disbelief. When she reached the center of the court, Elon took the microphone, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "Tonight," he began, "we honor a woman who has shaped more lives than she'll ever know. A woman who gave me the belief I needed when I didn't have it in myself. Eleanor Thornton is more than a teacher, she is a force for change. A beacon of hope for countless young people who have walked through her doors. And tonight I want to give something back. Not just for me, but for everyone whose life she has touched." Elon gestured toward the scoreboard, and the crowd hushed as images of the community center where Eleanor had spent so many years appeared on the Jumbotron. The camera panned to the excited faces of the children she had mentored over the years, all of them smiling, grateful for the impact she had made on their lives. Then, with a final flourish, Elon made his announcement. "In honor of Eleanor and all that she has done, my family and I are making a $2 million donation to renovate and expand the center. We are ensuring that her legacy lives on, so that future generations of young people can benefit from the same opportunities that she gave to so many of us. This is for you, Eleanor." The arena erupted in applause, but what happened next was even more profound. Elon walked toward Eleanor, took her hands in his, and whispered, "This is for everything you did for me, for all of us. Your work doesn't end here." He handed her a ceremonial check for the donation, but it was the look in his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just charity. This was a deep, heartfelt thank you, an acknowledgement of the profound impact she had had on his life. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she stood there, overwhelmed by the enormity of the gesture. She had never expected such recognition, let alone the tangible support Elon was offering. This wasn't just a life-changing moment for her, it was a reminder that the love and care she had poured into others had come full circle. The game had ended, but for Elon and Eleanor, this was a new beginning. For the first time in years, Elon Musk felt like he had done something that truly mattered. And for Eleanor, it was the affirmation that her work had changed the world, one person at a time.